Firstly, I want to acknowledge you for wanting to develop your listening. Listening is incredibly important, one of the most important skills in life. So awesome that you're here, and I hope I can support you in that. So I'm going to be looking at listening from a deeper lens. So there certainly will be practical things you can work on and things you can do, but I want to try to show you that this topic, it's not a quick fix. This is not about establishing a series of quick tips that you can take on to be able to really listen to people. If you really want to learn how to listen to people seriously as a life skill, it is a long-term thing to develop in yourself. Listening isn't actually one skill. It's a whole host of capacities you can develop. And so if you're looking for quick tips and tricks, there are many videos out there on that, but this won't be that. And yeah, I will still try to keep it practical. I'm going to start with a contrast of what someone who would be the worst possible listener you could imagine, what that would look like, and then what an ideal listener might look like. And the reason I want to start with this contrast is because it will illustrate the many different capacities and skills that make up a good listener and that a bad listener, in the moment at least, does not have. This gives us a direction to move towards in our inquiry about listening. So I think it will serve as a good starting point. So imagine for a moment, take a moment to think about this. What would the worst possible listener look like? Maybe bring to mind a time where you felt that you totally weren't listened to. Or even a time when you totally weren't listening to someone else. So just see what comes up for you when you put your attention on that for a moment. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and things may have come up. Maybe it's like you weren't paying attention at all, right? Like you just were totally ignoring. You were totally in your head, right? Or you were having an argument and you really didn't care about what the person was saying. You just wanted to be right, right? These are the kinds of things that I imagine might have come up. So let's paint a picture. What would the worst possible listener, what might that look like? Well, to me, when I imagine that, the person that is listening to you, quote, listening, is barely even aware of your existence in that moment. They're certainly not paying any attention to you. And worse, for the most part, you could just as easily be a rock to them. You could just as easily be an inanimate object. They're not really with your humanness at all. They don't care about you in that moment. They're completely in their own world, and specifically in their own head. So they're not present. They're either in the past, in their mind, in their thoughts, or in the future. They are not present, and they are not paying you any attention. Further, they're not open to you, right? As a kind of a consequence of this, they're not open to you. They're not receptive to you and really trying to get where you are. They're the opposite of that. They are totally certain about their own experience. They're not open to changing their mind or learning anything. All they want is to, most likely, get some need met that's an unspoken implicit need met from you. For example, they might want to emotionally dump on you because that feels good to them, because they get relief from doing that. They might want to emotionally dump on you, or they might want to validate some kind of like victim narrative they have, story they have about their lives and about the complaints they have, and they want to use you as a tool, like basically a tool for their use, practical use, to validate their own experience of themselves as a victim or whatever, like to get approval from you or to get validation from you. right? So this really paints a picture, right? And I think we've all had moments like this, right? Where we're just really not paying attention. It's about us being right. It's about us getting our needs met. And we're totally in our heads. We're not really present with the person. We're not open to them. And, they could just as easily be a rock to us. And they're talking over us, right? Things like they might just talk over you, this person. They're not listening to you. They're talking over you. They're waiting for you to get to the end of what you're saying so they can say their thing again because they want to be right. So they're using you as a way to validate themselves, etc. So this is the worst possible listener, right? And we've all had experiences like that, either where we're that person or we're the person on the other side and receiving that. Okay. So if you flip that on its head, what is the best possible listener, or the ideal listener? It's essentially the opposite, right? It's not about you. It's about really trying to really being curious and really being with the other person that you're listening to. And this is where it gets practical, right? Because it's about really being with them where they are, setting aside all of your beliefs and assumptions about them, all your personal concerns and thoughts, putting those to one side and being totally and completely present with the person. And not just with what they say, not just with the words they use, but with their body language, resonating with their emotions, so feeling their feelings with them empathically, and also listening for the deeper context or the deeper things that they're not saying that's still true. So essentially, the ideal listener will be taking in the person's whole being, openly, receptively, and with that curiosity and acceptance of the person. And in a sense, you're totally open as this ideal listener to learning and to discovering something new about yourself or the other person. There's a lot less certainty about what you're going to find. You really don't know what you're going to find in that listening because you're open. And in fact, the things you might find may totally go against your worldview and your way of seeing things. And you've got to be open to that. If you're really listening to someone, you've got to be open to having your experience and your mind changed and transformed by being with them and listening to them like that. So we have something to move away from now, and we have something to move towards. And hopefully, and I also imagine we've all had experiences of both, where we've really listened or been listened to and really not listened and not been listened to. So think of it like a spectrum. We're not always at one side or the other, but at different times we have different levels of receptivity to the other person. And maybe what we want then is to start to shift and see what skills we can develop to move further towards the ideal listening person and further away from the worst listening person. So this gives us kind of a starting point. And hopefully I've illustrated here also that it's not just one thing, although there are some very core things like being present that you got to have. It's not just one skill. It's actually a whole host of things, like being present, being curious, like listening to the words, but also resonating with your body. So listening to your own body while you're with the person to empathetically get them, right? Learning how to set aside your own beliefs. And I think the one point that maybe, if I had to pick one for us to focus on for how to develop in our listening, it would be this point. It would be the biggest obstacle that gets in the way of us listening, right, is our own personal view and our own basically survival and our own identity gets in the way of us listening, gets in the way of us paying attention. And it does that because when we put ourselves first and we focus, and especially when we're in our head and we put ourselves first and we're in our own minds, we're not really with the other person. And when we're in our own heads, we're also in all the assumptions we have about the other person. right? We're not really seeing them for who they are. We're not seeing what's there. So this is where we get into some subtlety. Because the trickiness in really listening deeply and developing a deep listening is learning how to see when you are placing a kind of filter over your experience and the experience of the other person, like you, on the other person. And that filter, which is made up of your personal meanings and assumptions about them, that filter, or those many filters actually, it blocks you from really being with them. And we do it. So then why would we do that? Why would we put these filters on the person? Well, again, we do this because when we're thinking about ourselves and taking care of our own survival, we need to form beliefs, models about how life is and about how other people are in order to navigate life, especially when we're younger. So we have all these beliefs and assumptions based on our experience that we've kind of assumed about other people, and we're carrying those everywhere we go. And so when we are in conversation with someone, we're not really fully in conversation with them. We're in conversation with them plus all of our filters with which we see them and listen to them. And the trick is to learn how to pay attention and to notice and be aware of those filters as we apply them, as they come up for us. This is, if there was one thing I could say about how to develop listening, it would be to learn how to notice those almost invisible filters that we place and to just become aware of them. And projections and judgments, right? There's filters. Filters is a big word that can take many forms. It could be judgments, projections, beliefs, assumptions. And these are not just in our heads. They're actually visceral. They're a feeling that we have about the other person. So as a classic example of this, maybe you were bullied at school, and you just happen to be having a conversation with someone who physically resembles the person who bullied you. You're not going to be totally neutral with this person. You're going to have filters. Like, you're not going to be able to help it. You're going to have some sort of filters or aversion probably to this person. Or there'll be certain ways of interacting with them that doesn't feel comfortable because you don't want to risk getting bullied, right? You don't want to risk. So it's not just in our mind, it's also embodied. It's in our whole experience of the other person. That's one example. And there are thousands and thousands of filters like that, right? Based on our real experience, but that are the models we used to navigate when we were younger, and that don't work now. They're outdated, and they actually stop us from really listening. So the trick is to notice those. Noticing them alone is good, and it will help us to get space from them and kind of disidentify with them, with those filters and beliefs. We can also own them in conversation. So if we have that experience, if we notice we have, oh, I'm just realizing I had some kind of assumption about you because your face reminds me of someone who, picked on me at school. And I had just an assumption about you, and I'm just noticing that, and it's a bit scary to share that, but I don't want to have that. I don't know you. I don't want to have that assumption about you. So owning it, right, as your experience that you're having that is not about the other person. It's about you. So you can do that too. You can own it in conversation, can be a really powerful, it's vulnerable, but it can be a really powerful way of letting go of these assumptions. creates a lot of space for new discovery to arise, right? Another thing we can do is noticing our embodied experience. So often these filters, so are literally our bodies, often these filters come up as feelings. Always, actually. There's always a feeling associated with the filter. So if we can get a bit out of our heads and be kind of more present with our feeling experience and all of our senses and capacities when we're listening, right? So it's not just about hearing, it's about all your senses. Notice what the feeling is, and that again can help us to step back and notice, oh, we have this feeling. And even just sharing the feeling can help us move closer to people and to really listen to them. I hinted at another one there, I'm just going to make it explicit. Using all of our senses. When we want to really listen to someone, we set aside our filters, get into our bodies, and it's not just the words, right? It's what is their body language? What is not being said? What is at the edge of awareness that we're noticing about the person? And can we speak that and, open that connection between you a little bit more? So it's not just the words. It's also how the person is feeling and what they're not saying. And we can listen for that too. We can listen for that. So these give us a kind of direction to move in. Another would be learning how to be opening ourselves up and being really curious about what we can discover in connection with this person as we listen to them. So I wonder if you've had that experience of being with someone where they're really, really curious about you and they're asking you questions and you can tell they really want to learn from you. They really want to get to be with you more in your experience with you. When you have an experience like that, it feels really good to have someone really pay attention and be curious about you. It can be a bit vulnerable, a bit intimate as well. But it's generally really nice and it's really unusual to have someone take interest in you and not try and get something from you, which is what we often do in conversation. So we can do that too. We can get really curious about what's going on for the other person and curious about their lives and who they are and listen to them as if we don't know. Because the truth is, maybe I'll end on this point, is that it's very important for us to recognize that although we create all these filters and assumptions about the world in order to navigate it, especially when we're younger, it's not true. None of the filters and assumptions we have are true. And yet we're so certain of them, like we live as if they're true. The truth is, we're so scared of not knowing, of the uncertainty of really facing reality head on and the mystery of it. It's scary and it's so unknown and also so alive and exciting, right? That we often we aren't willing to give up our certainty about how life is and how other people are when we're listening to them. We often aren't willing to discover what's really true. It's much easier to feel like we already know the person. We already know what's true. So the really important stance to have on this is that there's just so much we don't know, and that as we start to let go of our assumptions, noticing them and letting them go, and as we start to listen to people more deeply, we get more present to the fact of just how much we don't know, how much deep complexity and nuance and this is infinite well of depth that the other person represents. And once that happens, and we start having that with more and more people who we had all these assumptions about, as more of that happens, it's also a vehicle for that same experience of listening, for us to have that with ourselves. Because really, we're just this, and I'm going to end on this point, We're just the same. We are so mysterious, even to ourselves. As it's almost cliche, but one of the noble truths in Buddhism is nothing is permanent. There's no permanent fixedness in reality. Everything is continuously moving and impermanent. Experience constantly changes. We are constantly changing. We're constantly in motion. So can we ever really know ourselves as people? Can we ever be done, right? And of course we can't, because we're always transforming, we're always changing. And really, to really listen to ourselves and others is to be more connected to the truth of that impermanence, and the truth of that reality is mysterious and it's constantly moving, and we can't ever truly know it, but we don't need to know it to deeply commune with it and to feel connected and fulfilled in our relationships and with ourselves. So, I hope this was useful to you as an exploration. There's so much lack of listening in the world, especially when I think about social media and how tribal it is and how polarized it is, and how people just don't listen to each other. People do this thing of feeling that they're certain and have all these assumptions and filters they have of the other group, and then they're not willing to really listen. And because it's scary to discover what's really true, and that you might not be right about what you think is true, and that your beliefs and assumptions about reality and yourself and others are so flimsy and so radically reductionist, and they hold up to almost no scrutiny if you're willing to be open and to explore what's really there with humility and openness and honesty and transparency with yourself and with others when you're listening. So I hope this was useful to you. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. Do drop a comment and a like and subscribe, and hope to see you on the next one. Take care.